The little girl was not crying. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the crowd gathering near the fountain, not the frantic voices overlapping into white noise, not even the way the late afternoon sun had turned the plaza gold and strange. What I noticed was the silence coming from the child sitting on the edge of the stone fountain, her small legs dangling, her dark eyes watching the water below with a kind of calm that didn't belong on a face that young. I was still holding my tray. The shift had ended 12 minutes ago. I knew because I'd been counting. The way I always counted the last minutes of a Friday at Lena's diner, calculating whether I had enough time to catch the 6:15 bus before the evening rush made the walk unbearable. My apron was still tied, my hair, pale and escaping from its knot, the way it always did by the end of a long day, was stuck to the side of my neck from the heat. I should have kept walking. Instead, I stopped. The girl couldn't have been older than 4. Maybe 5. She was dressed in something that seemed too fine for a public plaza. A soft cream dress with small embroidered details at the collar, the kind of clothing that whispered money without shouting it. Her dark hair was pulled into 2 uneven pigtails, one slightly looser than the other, as if whoever had done them had been in a hurry, or hadn't quite known how. She sat perfectly still, one hand resting open on her knee, the other trailing her fingers along the surface of the fountain water. No one was with her. The crowd nearby wasn't looking at her. They were filming something on the opposite side of the plaza. A street performer, maybe. Or some minor scene I couldn't see. The noise and the light were all pointed the wrong direction. "Hey," I said, setting my tray down on a nearby bench. My voice came out softer than I intended. "Hey, sweetheart. Are you lost?" She looked up. Her eyes were extraordinary. Not the color, which was simply dark, almost black, but the quality of them. The steadiness. Children that age usually shifted their gaze, looked away, looked back. She looked at me and stayed looking, with an attention that felt older than her face. "My shoe came off," she said. I looked down. Sure enough, one small white shoe sat beside her on the fountain's edge. The sock was still on her foot, slightly damp at the toe from where she'd been dragging it through the water. "Okay," I said, crouching down. "Can I help you put it back on?" She considered me for a moment. Genuinely considered, the way people 3 times her age sometimes forgot to, and then nodded. I picked up the shoe. It was small enough to fit in my palm. I slipped it back onto her foot, the Velcro strap still sticky and easy to close. And when I looked up, she was still watching me with that same unnerving calm. "What's your name?" I asked. "Lena," she said. I almost smiled at that. Same name as the diner. "That's a beautiful name. I'm Maisie. Where's your dad? Lena? Or your mom?" Something shifted in her expression. Not grief. Not quite. More like the face a person makes when they've gotten used to a question hurting and have taught themselves to absorb it quietly. "My dad is probably looking for me," she said. "I walked too far." "How far did you walk?" She pointed vaguely toward the north end of the plaza, where a row of upscale restaurants and a private event space occupied the better half of the block. I knew the area. We got overflow customers sometimes when those places were full. People who'd made reservations somewhere fancier and ended up at Lena's because the wait was too long. They always seemed faintly disappointed and then surprised by how good the food actually was. "Okay," I said, straightening up. "Then let's go back and find him." I held out my hand. She looked at it, then at me, then took it. Her hand was very small inside mine. We walked. She matched my pace without being told to, which surprised me. Most children that age pulled ahead or dragged behind, impatient or distracted. Lena walked beside me with a composure that made me feel strangely like I was the one being accompanied rather than the one accompanying her. "Do you work here?" she asked, looking at my apron. "At the diner, yes, just finished." "Do you like it?" I thought about the honest answer. The burned coffee smell that clung to my hair on bad days. The customer who'd snapped his fingers at me twice this afternoon. The way the tips had been thin all week and rent was due in 11 days. Some days more than others, I said. She nodded, as though that was exactly the right answer. We had nearly reached the north end of the plaza when I heard it. The shift in the air more than an actual sound, a kind of collective intake of breath from the people nearest the private event building. Then voices, sharp and urgent, radiating outward in a wave. And then I saw him. He came through the glass doors of the event space like a storm that had decided to take a human shape. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a controlled speed that somehow looked unhurried, even though he was clearly moving fast. 2 men flanked him, speaking close to his ear, but his attention had already swept past them and across the plaza with a precision that felt less like searching and more like hunting. He found us in 3 seconds. I know because I counted those 2, though I couldn't have told you why. 1. His gaze passed left. 2. It swept right. 3. It landed on Lena, and on me, standing beside her, still holding her hand, and stopped. He was not what I expected. I didn't know what I expected exactly. Someone flustered, maybe. Worried. The private, expensive panic of a parent who'd turned around and found empty space. He wasn't flustered, but the way the tension left his body when he saw Lena, it happened in a single breath. Visible even from across the distance between us, was one of the most human things I had ever seen on a face that otherwise gave nothing away. He walked toward us. Up close, he was more overwhelming than he'd seemed from a distance, which was saying something, because from a distance he had already been the most noticeable person in a crowded plaza. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, I guessed, with the kind of face that seemed carved from something harder than ordinary expression. A jaw that looked like a decision, eyes that looked like a conclusion. Dark hair, slightly longer than conventional. A suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who don't need to think about expense. He crouched down in front of Lena, and the transformation was immediate. "There you are," he said. His voice, directed at her, was low and quiet, and nothing like the authority I'd felt radiating off him from across the plaza. "I told you to wait by the door." "I wanted to see the fountain," Lena said, without apology, but also without defiance. "My shoe came off. Maisie helped me." He looked up at me. I was not prepared for that. The directness of it, like being stepped into a beam of light you didn't know was there. "Maisie," he repeated. Not a question. Not quite an introduction. Just the word, in that low voice, as if he was filing it somewhere. "I work at the diner across the plaza," I said, because I felt I should say something and that seemed like a neutral and factual option. "I found her sitting at the fountain alone. I was just walking her back." He held my gaze for a moment that lasted longer than it should have. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. Simple ones. But something in the way he said them made them feel heavier than their size, like he meant something more layered than gratitude for a returned shoe and a short walk, though I couldn't have explained why I felt that. He stood. His full height returned him to something less approachable. One of the men behind him murmured something I couldn't catch, and his expression shifted back to that unreadable quality. The thing I'd seen him wearing from across the plaza. Lena, still holding my hand, looked up at him, and then up at me, back and forth, the way children do when they're calculating something adults don't know they're calculating. Then, with absolute certainty, with the same composure she'd used to tell me her shoe had come off, she said, "This is my mummy." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. His eyes came back to mine. I opened my mouth. I closed it. The tray I'd left on the bench across the plaza suddenly felt like a very important thing to go and retrieve, except my feet had apparently forgotten how to move. Lena was still holding my hand. She wasn't looking up at me with mischief or confusion. She was looking up at her father with the simple, uncomplicated confidence of someone stating a fact they are certain of, He was looking at me, and in his expression, in that unreadable, carved stone face, I saw something I didn't have a name for. Not amusement, not dismissal. Something quieter and stranger. Something that looked, just for a fraction of a second, almost like recognition. I did not sleep well that night. This was not unusual. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had opinions about wind. The windows rattled when the weather changed, and the radiator in the corner made a sound like someone knocking politely at irregular intervals throughout the night. I'd lived there for 2 years, and had never fully adjusted to either. But that night it wasn't the windows, or the radiator keeping me awake. It was the way he had looked at me. I lay on my back, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, shaped, if you tilted your head, like a running fox, and replayed it the way you replay something you're not sure actually happened. The plaza, the fountain, Lena's small hand in mine. The moment she'd said those words with such complete, unself-conscious certainty. This is my mummy. And then his face. That fraction of a second where something moved behind the stillness. I pressed my palms against my eyes. It meant nothing. Children said things like that. Children attached themselves to strangers in parks and declared them family, and forgot about it by the time they got home. Lena had been alone, a little disoriented, and I had been kind to her. That was all. It was a sweet, slightly embarrassing moment that would dissolve into ordinary life by morning. I told myself this clearly and firmly. I believed approximately none of it. Saturday morning at Lena's diner was controlled chaos with a thin layer of maple syrup over everything. The breakfast rush hit at 8, and didn't release its grip until well past 10, by which point I had refilled the coffee station 3 times, mediated a dispute between 2 tables over who had ordered the last portion of blueberry pancakes, and somehow managed to keep my section running without dropping anything significant. It was the kind of morning that was almost meditative in its relentlessness. No space for thought. Just movement and order, and the muscle memory of a job I'd been doing long enough that my body knew it without being asked. It was during the brief lull between the breakfast crowd thinning and the early lunch arrivals that Dara appeared at my elbow. Dara was the other long-term waitress. She'd been at Lena's for 6 years to my 3, and she carried that seniority not with superiority, but with a kind of comfortable authority, the way someone carries a coat they've worn so long it's shaped itself to their shoulders. She was in her late 30s, dark-haired, with sharp eyes that missed very little. "Table by the window is asking for you specifically," she said, refilling the sugar dispensers without looking up. "For me?" "By name." She glanced up then, something careful in her expression. "Maisie," that's what the man said. I looked toward the window table. He was already looking back. "Orion." I didn't know his name yet. That came later. But even then, seeing him sitting in the ordinary wooden chair of an ordinary diner, I thought, he makes everything around him look like a stage set. Not because he was performing, because he was so genuinely, completely himself, that everything else became context. He was in a darker suit today, jacket on despite the warmth. Lena sat across from him, her feet swinging under the table, examining the laminated menu with the same focused attention she'd given the fountain water. Her pigtails were slightly better today. Only slightly. I walked over. "Mr. I started. "Orion," he said. No last name offered. Just the one word, spoken the way people say their name when they're used to it being enough. "Orion," I repeated. "Can I get you something?" He looked at me steadily. "We came to thank you properly. Lena wanted to." Lena looked up from the menu. "You have chocolate ones," she announced, pointing. "With banana." "We do," I said. "They're very good. I want that." "Lena," he said, the single word a quiet reminder. "Please," she added, looking at me with complete sincerity. Something about it made my chest feel strange. The softness of it, the ordinary domestic normalcy of a father correcting a child's manners in a diner on a Saturday morning. It didn't fit the image he projected. And yet it fit him, I thought. It fit the version of him I'd seen for one breath in the plaza. I took their order. Chocolate banana pancakes for Lena, black coffee and nothing else for him, which told me either he didn't eat in the mornings or he hadn't come for the food. When I came back with the coffee, he said, without preamble, "You handled yesterday well." I set the cup down. I just walked her back. Most people would have looked for the nearest security guard and handed her off. That's also a reasonable thing to do. It is, he agreed. You didn't. I wasn't sure if that was a compliment or an observation or something else entirely. His tone made everything land in the ambiguous territory between them. She was calm, I said. She made it easy. He looked at Lena, who was now drawing patterns on the paper placemat with the end of a spoon, absorbed in some private project. Something in his expression when he watched her was the most unguarded thing about him. A quiet, unperformed tenderness that he didn't seem to notice he was showing. "She's usually calm," he said. "She gets that from her mother." The past tense was subtle. He didn't linger on it, but I heard it, and I understood it, and I chose not to ask. "She's wonderful," I said instead, and meant it simply. He looked back at me. "She told me this morning that you're very nice and that you smell like vanilla." I felt my face do something involuntary. "That's the diner. The pastries." "I know." A pause. "She also told me she's decided you're her mummy now, and that I should probably speak to you about it." The way he said it, so level, so carefully neutral, and yet with something underneath that wasn't quite neutral at all, made me press my lips together to keep from making a sound I'd regret. "That's... children sometimes," I started. "I know what children do," he said. "I'm not here to make you uncomfortable. I only thought you should know," she said it again. At some length, apparently, over breakfast. "I'm flattered," I managed. "Truly. She's remarkable." "She is." He picked up the coffee cup, looked into it briefly. "She hasn't said that about anyone before." The words dropped into the space between us with a weight I didn't know what to do with. I was saved from responding by the kitchen bell signaling Lena's pancakes were ready, and I excused myself with more relief than I wanted to admit. They stayed for nearly an hour. I noticed between my other tables the way Lena ate with focused enthusiasm and explained things to her father between bites. The pattern she'd drawn on the placemat, something she'd apparently decided about birds while looking out the window, a question about why the sugar came in paper packets instead of a bowl. He answered each thing with patient attention, never dismissive, never distracted by his phone or the middle distance. He was, I realized, a man who was entirely present when he chose to be. The difficulty was that he so rarely seemed to choose to be present with anyone other than her. When I brought the check, he looked at it briefly and then at me. "You're here every Saturday?" he asked. "Most of them." He nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. He left a tip that was more than the bill, tucked under the edge of the cup without comment. As they were leaving, Lena stopped at the door and turned back to find me. I was at the counter, already moving to clear their table, and she crossed the few feet between the door and the counter with the decisive walk of someone who knows what they came to do. She held something out to me. It was the placemat. She'd torn the corner she'd been drawing on, carefully, in a rough but intentional square, and folded it twice. On it, in the unsteady lines of a child still learning to control a crayon, was a drawing. 2 figures, one tall, one small. And beside the small one, another figure with what appeared to be very long, light-colored hair and something round in its hand, which I thought might have been meant to be my tray. Under it, in large, uneven letters that someone, her father, I guessed, from the steadiness of the hand, had written for her. "Maisie, thank you." "Lena." I held the folded paper placemat and looked up. Orion was standing at the door, watching, not the way he'd watched across the plaza, with that hunter scan, sweeping and assessing. This was quieter, more like the way you look at something you're trying to memorize before it's gone. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he turned and walked out, one hand resting lightly on Lena's shoulder, into the bright Saturday street. I stood at the counter with a torn piece of paper placemat in my hand, and the absolutely irrational feeling that something had just begun. He came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. By the third week, Dara had stopped pretending not to notice. She said nothing directly. Dara was too intelligent for direct. But she began leaving the window table open on Saturday mornings, even when the rush made every other seat contested. And she handed me their section with a look that communicated volumes without requiring a single word. Lena always ordered the chocolate banana pancakes. Orion always ordered black coffee and nothing else. And every week, without fail, Lena brought something, a drawing, a question. Once a small smooth stone she'd found on the way, and decided I should have because it was, in her estimation, a very good one. I kept all of it. The drawings went on the small corkboard above my kitchen table, slightly crooked, their crayon colors bright against the ordinary beige of my apartment wall. The stone sat on the windowsill next to the plant I was only partially successfully keeping alive. I didn't examine why I kept them. I just did. What changed in those weeks was small and cumulative, the way most significant things change. Orion began to stay longer, not dramatically. 10 minutes more, 1 week. 15 the next. He refilled his coffee twice instead of once. He asked, the fourth Saturday, whether the kitchen made anything other than breakfast after 10. And when I told him about the lunch menu, he looked at it with the focused attention he gave everything and ordered a sandwich he ate slowly, while Lena colored at the table beside him with a small set of pencils she'd apparently started bringing specifically for diner visits. We talked. Not about anything large. Not at first. He asked about the diner's history. 40 years, 2 owners. The current owner, Petra, who came in on Thursdays and argued cheerfully with the cook about soup. I asked about Lena's school, which apparently she attended with an attitude of benevolent tolerance for the other children and a passionate interest in the science corner specifically. She told her teacher that caterpillars are braver than people, he said, with the careful neutrality of someone reporting a fact they find privately amusing. Is she wrong? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile. He didn't smile easily. I was learning. But the movement before a smile. The thing that happens in the eyes first. Her teacher didn't seem to think the comparison was appropriate for circle time. Lena probably made a compelling case. She always does. It was the most natural conversation I'd had in longer than I could easily measure. That was the thing about Orion that I hadn't expected. Not the authority, which was obvious, or the control, which was constant, but the quality of his attention. When he was talking to you, you were the only thing in the room. Not in a way that felt like performance or strategy. In a way that felt almost disorienting, because most people's attention was fractured by default, and you forgot what it felt like when it wasn't. I didn't let myself think too carefully about what that meant. It was Dara who told me, on a Tuesday in the 5th week, between the lunch rush and the afternoon quiet. She sat across from me in the break room, both hands around a cup of tea, and said, "You know who he is?" It wasn't a question, but my silence answered it anyway. "Maisie, I know he's someone," I said. "The way people move around him, the men who wait outside. He's not just someone." Dara set her cup down. "Orion Voss. He runs the Voss Group, about 6 international companies, 2 development foundations, and something else that people talk about in lower voices." She paused. "He also leads something older than any of that. A community. Old families, old rules. People who've existed outside of ordinary hierarchies for a very long time." I looked at her. "Wolves," she said simply, and held my gaze. The break room was very quiet. "You've known this whole time," I said. "I suspected from the first Saturday. His name confirmed it by the second." She picked up her tea again. "I grew up near one of the outer communities. I know what the old families look like when they walk into a room. I sat with this. Orion Voss, an alpha. The kind of leader that the word king was not entirely metaphorical for, in certain old vocabularies. A man who moved like a storm, and watched like a hawk, and brought his 4-year-old daughter for chocolate banana pancakes every Saturday morning, at a diner where the windows rattled in wind. "He keeps coming back," I said. It was less a statement than a thing I was trying to understand out loud. "Yes," Dara said. "He does. Because of Lena." Dara looked at me with the specific patience of someone who has decided not to argue with something they find transparently incorrect. "If you like," she said. The thing about knowing was that it changed the texture of everything without changing the facts. He was still the same man who sat at the window table and drank black coffee and watched his daughter explain her drawings with an audience's complete attention. Knowing what he was, what world he came from, what he carried, didn't make him more frightening exactly. It made him more comprehensible, in a strange way. The quality of stillness, the weight of his presence, the way the two men who waited outside were always just outside, never intrusive, but never absent. The following Saturday, I was aware of all of it differently, and I thought he noticed. He was too perceptive not to. He waited until Lena had taken her pencils to the far end of the table to draw something she'd described as a map of the best places, the criteria for which remained pleasantly unclear, before he said quietly, "You know," not a question. I'd noticed he rarely asked questions he already knew the answers to. "Yes," I said. He looked at his coffee cup. A moment passed. "Does it change something for you?" I thought about the honest answer. The version where I said, "It should, probably. It should make me careful. It should make me remember that I am a waitress in a diner who found a lost child at a fountain, and that whatever this has become in these Saturday mornings is a thing that exists in a very small, very ordinary space that is not my world and not his, and probably not sustainable." "I don't know yet," I said instead. He looked up. "That's an honest answer." "I try." Something moved through his expression. That thing I still didn't have a name for. The almost recognition. It had appeared every time I'd said something he hadn't calculated for. And I was beginning to understand that very few things surprised him, and that this somehow did. "There are people," he said carefully, "in my community, who have opinions about who I spend time with, who Lena spends time with." He paused. "I want you to understand that before this goes further. Before this goes further." The phrase landed between us with a particular weight. "Orion," I said, and his name felt different in my mouth than other names. Heavier, more careful. "What is this, exactly?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I'm not certain yet," he said, "but I find I keep coming back to find out." Lena appeared at my elbow, map in hand, apparently finished. She held it up. The diner occupied the center, labeled with something that looked like Maisie in her large, uneven letters. Their house was in the upper corner. A park was somewhere to the left. Lines connected everything in a cheerful web. "You're in the middle," she told me, with the tone of someone delivering important geographical data. "Because you're the middle of the important places." I looked at the map. I looked at Orion. He was watching me with the coffee cup held still in his hand, and an expression that, for once, he wasn't entirely controlling. I folded the map carefully and tucked it into my apron pocket. "Thank you, Lena," I said. "That's the nicest thing anyone's put me in the middle of." But later, walking home through the early autumn evening, the folded map in my pocket and the cooler air moving through my pale hair, I thought about what Dara had said. Old families, old rules, people with opinions. And I thought about the way Orion had said before this goes further. Not if, but before. The distinction felt significant. It also felt in the particular quiet of that walk home, like the beginning of something I was not entirely prepared for and could not entirely bring myself to step away from. Which was, I was beginning to understand exactly the problem. 1. 978 palavras. Posso avançar para o bloco 4? Você disse, o Coca 09. 02 Claude respondeu, bloco 4. The invitation came on a Wednesday. Not through Orion directly. That would have been too simple, and nothing about his world operated simply, I was learning. It came through a woman named Sable, who walked into the diner at 2:30 in the afternoon when the place was nearly empty, sat at the counter, and ordered tea she had no intention of drinking. She was somewhere in her 50s, elegant in the particular way of people who have never had to think about being elegant. It was simply the water they swam in. Dark clothing, silver at her ears, hair pulled back with architectural precision. She watched me work for approximately 4 minutes before she spoke. "You're Maisie," she said. I set down the teapot. "I am. I'm Sable Voss." A pause that had clearly been calculated. Orion's aunt. I kept my expression neutral. I had been practicing that lately. "He's hosting a gathering this weekend," she said, "at the estate. It happens twice a year. The whole community comes. Families, elders, the younger generation." She picked up the tea she wasn't going to drink and held it. "Lena has asked, apparently with some persistence, that you be invited." "And Orion?" I asked. Sable looked at me with the sharp, assessing gaze of someone who had been evaluating people for a very long time. He agreed. "But you didn't," I said. Something moved in her expression. Surprise, briefly, and then something closer to reluctant respect. "I have questions," she said carefully. "About intentions. About what a woman in your position understands about what she'd be walking into." I pulled out the chair across from her and sat down, which seemed to surprise her further. "Then ask them." She studied me for a moment. Then she set the tea down and asked them. She was thorough. I gave her that. She wanted to know how I'd come to be at the plaza, what I knew about the community, what I thought Lena's attachment to me represented, and, most directly, what I expected from Orion. She asked the last question with the precise delicacy of someone placing something fragile on an uncertain surface. "I don't expect anything from him," I said. "We have breakfast on Saturdays. We talk. That's the whole of it." "That's not the whole of it," she said. "Not from where I'm standing." "Then I'd be interested to know what you see from where you're standing." Another pause. Longer this time. "A man who has been closed since his wife passed," she said quietly. "Closed in the way a house is closed when no one intends to come back to it. And someone, has started leaving lights on." The break room at the back of the diner was very quiet. The cook was moving around in the kitchen, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon. "I'm not trying to open anything," I said. "I found a lost child at a fountain." "I know." Sable looked at her tea. "But she called you Mummy, and he didn't correct her." I had nothing to say to that. She slid a card across the counter. An address, a time, Saturday at 4. "The gathering begins at sundown," she said. "But he'd like you there before. Lena would like you there before." She stood, smoothing her jacket. "I am not your enemy, Maisie. I want you to understand that. I am someone who loves that child and that man, and who has watched them both carry grief that was too heavy for either of them. I simply needed to see you for myself." "And?" I said. She picked up her bag. "And Lena has good instincts," she said, which I understood was the closest thing to approval she was prepared to offer today. "Don't be late." The estate was not what I expected, which probably said something about the limits of my expectations. I'd imagined something imposing, all dark stone and deliberate grandeur, the architectural equivalent of a declaration. What I found instead, when the car Orion had sent turned through a set of open gates and wound up a long gravel drive, was something that felt more like intention than intimidation. Large, yes. Old, certainly, but surrounded by trees that had been there far longer than the building and settled into the landscape with the ease of something that had stopped trying to prove itself. Orion met me at the door. He was in different clothes than I'd seen him in before. Still precise, still himself, but without the suit jacket, the collar open, the formality slightly set aside in a way that made him look more reachable and simultaneously more dangerous. Because formality had been a kind of buffer, and without it the full weight of him was just there, immediate and unfiltered. "You came," he said. "You asked." Lena asked. "You agreed," I said, which was Sable's logic returned, and he recognized it. I saw it in the brief movement at the corner of his mouth. He showed me through the house before the guests arrived. I understood this was deliberate, giving me the geography before it filled with people, letting me find my footing. The rooms were large but lived in. Lena's presence was everywhere. Drawings on the refrigerator, small shoes near the back door, a collection of smooth stones on the hallway windowsill that made me think of the one she'd given me, still sitting at my apartment window. Lena herself found me in the garden, running from the direction of the kitchen with the focused velocity of someone on important business. "You're here," she announced, arriving at my knees and looking up with the satisfaction of a person whose plan has worked. "I told Papa you'd come." "You were right," I said. "I'm usually right," she said, with no particular pride, just accuracy. I spent the next hour in the garden with her while Orion moved between preparations and the beginning arrivals. I watched the community come in. Families with children, older couples, younger men and women who moved with the particular fluency of people who knew exactly what they were and had never had to apologize for it. They were not what I'd expected either. They were mostly just people, warm with each other, easy in their bodies, filling the garden with noise and the smell of food someone had been cooking for hours. But they noticed me. Not rudely, not hostilely, for the most part, but with the careful attention of a community that had learned to read newcomers quickly and thoroughly. I felt the assessments happening in peripheral conversations, in the slight redirections of attention, in the way certain older members let their gaze rest on me a beat longer than casual. I held my posture and smiled and helped Lena explain her stone collection to a boy about her age who seemed skeptical, but was gradually being won over. It was a man named Conrad who made it explicit. He was perhaps 45, heavy-shouldered, with a pleasant face that had something underneath it that wasn't pleasant at all. He found me near the garden table, Lena having been collected by another child for some game involving the far tree line. "Human," he said, by way of greeting, and the word wasn't cruel but wasn't nothing either. "Maisie," I said back pleasantly. "The waitress." He smiled. "Lena's attachment to you is very sweet. Children that age form these connections quickly." "They do," I agreed. "And release them just as quickly," he added, still pleasantly, "when their circumstances change." I looked at him. I thought about several responses. "That may be true," I said, "but I find it's worth being kind regardless of how long it lasts. The duration doesn't change what the kindness was." He studied me for a moment. Then the pleasant smile returned, slightly different now, as if recalibrated. "Interesting," he said, and moved on. I released a slow breath. "He does that," said a voice beside me, and I turned to find a woman about my age, dark-eyed, with the easy stance of someone comfortable in this world. "Conrad. He finds the edges of people to see if they're soft." "And?" "You're not," she said, with what seemed like genuine approval. "I'm Riva. I've known Orion since we were children." She handed me a glass of something. "He hasn't looked away from you in 20 minutes, in case you hadn't noticed." I had noticed. I hadn't acknowledged it. "He's being a good host," I said. Riva laughed, a real one, unperformed. "He really isn't. He's terrible at gatherings. He stands in one place and people come to him because it's easier than watching him try to circulate." She glanced toward where he stood, at the far edge of the garden, talking to two older men but oriented, with that subtle physical awareness toward where I was. He's been different these past weeks, since the Saturday started. She looked at me directly. Lena isn't the only one who's decided something about you. The garden was full of golden evening light, the sun dropping behind the trees, and everywhere around me this world, old and particular and not mine, was breathing and moving and watching. And across the garden, Orion looked up from his conversation and found me, the way he had found me across the plaza on that first day, with that 3-second precision. He held my gaze, and this time, neither of us looked away first. The trouble came before the sun finished setting. I heard it first as a change in the quality of the noise, the warm, crowded sound of the gathering shifting into something with an edge, conversations dropping in register, movement becoming purposeful rather than social. Lena, who had been chasing the other child near the trees, was quietly collected by a woman I didn't know, and moved toward the house without explanation. Orion was already moving. I stayed where I was, beside Riva, who had gone very still in the particular way of someone who has learned that stillness is information. "What's happening?" I asked quietly. "The Harrow faction," she said, just as quietly. "Conrad's people. They've been building toward this for months, questioning whether Orion's leadership is still focused, whether his priorities have shifted." A pause. "You being here tonight gave them a reason to make it public." The realization settled over me with a cold clarity. I was the reason. Not the only reason. Riva's tone told me this had been coming regardless. But tonight, my presence had handed them a visible symbol to point at. A human woman, a waitress. At the Alpha King's gathering, in his garden, watched by his eyes for 20 unguarded minutes. Conrad had moved to the center of the garden space and was speaking, his voice carrying with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed this. I caught the shape of it without every word. Distraction, compromise, the integrity of leadership, what it means to guide a community when one's attention is elsewhere. Around him, faces varied, some nodding, some carefully neutral, some visibly uncomfortable but silent. Orion stood at the edge of the group, and the stillness he carried now was a different kind than the one I knew from Saturday mornings. This was the stillness before something moves. I should have stayed where I was. Every practical instinct I had said, "You are a guest here. This is not your conflict. This community has rules and structures and histories you don't fully understand. Stay quiet, stay small, let it resolve itself." I had spent a significant portion of my life staying quiet and staying small. I knew the posture well. I knew how to fold myself into the background of other people's spaces and wait for the discomfort to pass. I walked forward anyway, not toward Conrad, toward Orion. I felt the shift in attention as I moved. The gathering's awareness swinging toward me. The thing Conrad had been pointing at now in motion, now visible, now doing something unexpected. I heard Riva make a small sound behind me that might have been concern or might have been something else. I stopped beside Orion. Not behind him. Beside him. He looked at me. Something moved through his expression. A rapid, private assessment. And then he was still again. Conrad had paused mid-sentence. "I apologize for interrupting," I said. And my voice came out steadier than I'd expected, carrying in the quiet garden with more ease than I'd intended. "I want to say something, if the community will allow it." The silence was complete. I didn't look at Conrad. I looked at the gathering, the faces, the range of them, the older members and the younger ones, the people who'd been warm and the ones who'd been watchful. "I'm Maisie," I said. "I'm human. I work at a diner. 3 weeks ago, I found a lost little girl at a fountain and walked her back to her father." I paused. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he was. I knew she was small and alone, and her shoe had come off, and that was enough. Someone in the gathering shifted. I kept going. I'm not here because I have a claim on anything in this world. I'm here because Lena asked me to come, and Orion said yes. And I thought... I stopped. Restarted. I thought that people who build something worth protecting usually started by simply being kind to one person in front of them. That's what I did. That's all I did. I looked at Conrad then. His pleasant face was unreadable. I understand that my being here raises questions for some of you, I said. That's fair. I'm an outsider. I don't know your history or your rules. Not fully. But I know that the man standing beside me spent 6 Saturday mornings making sure his daughter had somewhere gentle to be. I know he listens more than he speaks, and pays attention to things most people overlook. I know he corrects his daughter's manners, even when she's already being perfectly charming. A breath. Whatever questions you have about me, I can promise you his judgment is not the thing that needs defending tonight. The garden was very quiet. Lena's voice came from the doorway of the house, where she had apparently escaped her minder and was standing in her small cream dress with her slightly uneven pigtails, looking out at the assembly with her characteristic, untroubled composure. Maisie's right, she said, with the authority of someone 4 times her age. The gathering broke into sound, not chaos, but release, the exhale of a held breath, and in it, I heard the texture change again. Laughter from somewhere. A murmured exchange that sounded like agreement rather than agitation. Conrad said nothing further. He receded into the group with the smoothness of someone who had calculated that the moment had passed and that pressing it further would cost more than retreating. Orion had not moved. I became aware, standing beside him, of how close we were, the proximity that had accumulated without either of us formally acknowledging it, the way distance had been shortening since a Saturday morning 5 weeks ago, when he'd said before this goes further, and neither of us had stepped back. You didn't have to do that, he said quietly. For my ears only. I know, I said. It will make things more complicated. Probably. He turned to look at me fully. The golden evening light was nearly gone now, the garden moving into the softer illumination of the lanterns someone had lit along the paths, and in that light his face was different. Open in a way I hadn't seen before. The carved stone quality still there but worn thinner, showing something underneath. Maisie, he said. Orion. I need to tell you something. You can tell me on Saturday, I said. Over coffee. Something finally broke open in his expression. Not shattering. Nothing dramatic. Just the quiet giving way of something that had been held closed for a long time. The movement before a smile became, for the first time in my experience of him, an actual smile. Brief. Real. Entirely unperformed. Saturday, he agreed. Lena fell asleep on the drive home. Orion had insisted on sending the car. Curled on the seat beside me with her head on my arm, her breathing slow and even, one hand loosely holding my sleeve. I sat very still so as not to wake her, and watched the dark countryside give way to the city lights. I thought about what Riva had said. He hasn't looked away from you in 20 minutes. I thought about Sable's words in the diner. A house closed when no one intends to come back. Someone leaving lights on. I thought about a small folded placemat on my corkboard, and a smooth stone on my windowsill, and a map with my name in the middle. What happened after that was not a single dramatic moment. It was, like everything that had mattered in this story, slow and cumulative, and built from ordinary things. Saturdays continued. The window table became, without formal declaration, theirs, ours. Dara cleared it every week with the satisfied air of someone whose read on a situation has been confirmed. The drawings on my corkboard multiplied until they covered it entirely and began migrating to the kitchen wall. Orion spoke to the community elders in the weeks following the gathering. Reva told me later. She had become a genuine friend by then, which still surprised me pleasantly. That he had done it without apology and without drama, which was entirely consistent with everything I knew of him. He stated his intentions plainly. He answered questions. He did not ask permission, because that was not the nature of the position he held, but he offered explanation, which Reva said was more than many had expected, and enough for most. Conrad remained. Communities rarely excised their difficult members cleanly, and Orion didn't try to. What changed was the weight of Conrad's influence, which diminished in the quiet way of things that have been clearly named, and therefore lose their power to unsettle. Sable came to the diner the following month. She sat at the counter again and ordered tea she again did not drink, and this time she asked me about myself, not assessingly but genuinely, the difference unmistakable. She told me about Orion's wife, simply and without drama. A gentle woman, she said. Gone too soon. Lena had been barely 2. He closed, Sable said, the way people close when they're protecting what's left. I listened. I didn't try to fill the silence afterward. Good, Sable said eventually, as if I had passed a test neither of us had formally announced. Spring came. Lena turned 5 with a party in the estate garden that involved an impractical number of paper lanterns and a cake she had personally supervised the decoration of, resulting in something that was more enthusiastic than elegant and tasted extraordinary. She announced at the table, to assembled family and the Reva, and 2 of her school friends and me, that it had been the best birthday of her life so far, which she specified carefully because she intended to have many more. She had started calling me Maisie Mum. Not Mummy, as she had in the plaza, but Maisie Mum, a hybrid she'd apparently invented herself, a name that held both things at once without erasing either. The first time she said it in front of Orion, he had looked at her, and then at me, and the thing in his expression had been so unguarded that I had looked away to give him privacy with it. On a Saturday in early June, after the diner had gone quiet and Lena was at Sable's for the afternoon, Orion stayed at the window table long past the time he usually stayed. He said, I'd like you to be part of this. Not as a guest, not as a Saturday morning, as part of it. He was quiet a moment. As part of us. Outside the window, the street was bright and ordinary. The fountain in the plaza was visible from here, catching the summer light. I thought about the girl I'd been at that fountain, tired, counting the minutes until the bus, about to keep walking. I thought about how close I had come to doing exactly that. Yes, I said. He reached across the table and his hand covered mine, large and warm and steady, and we stayed like that in the quiet diner while the afternoon moved around us, unhurried. That evening, walking back through the plaza as the light turned gold, Orion beside me, Lena between us holding both our hands and swinging lightly, her small weight a warm pendulum. I understood that this was what belonging felt like. Not the absence of complication. Not the promise that nothing would ever be difficult again. Just this. The weight of a small hand. The steadiness of the one beside me. The ordinary, irreplaceable gold of a late afternoon that was entirely, completely, mine. Lena looked up. Can we get ice cream? She asked. Yes, we both said, at exactly the same moment. She laughed, the full, uncomplicated laugh of a child whose world is whole, and pulled us both forward into the evening,